Losing a loved one is difficult enough, but then you add all the decisions that need to be made.
Knowing what your loved one wants ahead of time, talking as a group to decide with the family what it is you want to do to honor the loved one can really help with planning.
Welcome to Weekend Connection. My name is Mike Dyes. Now, let's get connected. When a loved one dies, grieving members of the family often are confronted with many decisions about the funeral, all of which must normally be made quickly and during an emotionally stressful time. What kind of funeral should it be? What funeral provider should you use? What are you legally required to buy? And as a practical matter, how much is it all going to cost? Well, some help today on that as we talk with Patricia Poss, an attorney in the Division of Marketing Practices in the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. She coordinates the FTC's Funeral Rule program and works to combat fraud in lower income and underserved communities. Patricia, welcome to Weekend Connection.
Great. Thank you for having me. Terrific topic.
Well, how important is it to know about funeral choices ahead of time so we make the right decisions?
I think it is very important. So you raised several great issues there right off with those questions at the beginning of this interview. Planning a funeral can be difficult for families because of exactly what you were saying. It can come at a difficult time, and funerals can be expensive. They can cost thousands of dollars. And many people find themselves planning that funeral maybe for the first time when they've already are drained emotionally or physically tired after losing a loved one. So the FTC does offer, the Federal Trade Commission offers some tips for shopping for funeral services. We have a brochure and information on our website at ftc.gov. There's a brochure called Shopping for Funeral Services, and there's another one on it's a little bit shorter on paying final respects. It's your rights when you're buying funeral goods and services. But I'd love to get into a couple of those tips for shopping. And certainly, one of the things that can be helpful is to talk with loved ones and the family about what is wanted before the loved one passes, before there's that immediate need. And asking those questions that you phrased, do they want to be buried or cremated, embalmed? Do they want a viewing, a church service, a reception? What is it that they want? Because it can help a lot to know what it is you're looking for before you go shopping for funeral services, before you contact a funeral provider. And it also can help relieve some, potential emotional overspending. You don't want to feel guilty that you are not having the fanciest funeral. You won't have to feel guilty that you're not having the fanciest funeral if the loved one says that they want a simple service. So try to do some pre-need shopping if possible. And this will allow the family to talk about what's wanted and then compare prices for those specific services. And we recommend comparing prices from at least 2 different funeral homes. One of the things that's in that Shopping for Funeral Services guide, there's a brochure that has the pricing checklist, and it gives consumers a list of the funeral goods and services options that are typically out there and a place to write the price information that they collect from different companies to help make those decisions. So while I'm not certain that any decisions have to be made ahead of time, getting a sense of what is wanted and collecting at least the information about the options and costs from providers in your area can be helpful steps.
Well, I recently went through this process myself after the death of a loved one, and the terms, the choices, it was confusing, not knowing what was normally done and what I needed to do, dealing with the economics of it all. And it really can be confusing if you don't take some time ahead of time to prepare, right?
That's correct. And, you can ask a funeral provider to help you. State and local laws do vary. But there are some constants, and a funeral provider can help you through some of that. But doing your research ahead of time can save a lot of money, but also a lot of extra time and energy at a time when you may, well put that towards something else.
We're talking with Patricia Poss, an attorney in the Division of Marketing Practices in the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. I read that the average funeral costs are between $7,000 and $12,000, including viewing, burial, casket, The casket alone can cost $2,000 and even much more. The expenses don't include the cemetery or the grave markers, so you can quickly see it's an expensive issue and many decisions to be made. And cremation, for instance, it costs about a third of that. I've heard or read about buying caskets from companies that you wouldn't normally think about as supplying something like that. A big warehouse discount club, for instance, might actually sell caskets. Is a funeral home required to allow us to supply our own casket or urn if we choose to do that?
Yes. Consumers have the right to buy separate goods like caskets and urns. They do not have to buy the casket from the funeral home as a condition for using the home services. So under the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule, the funeral provider cannot refuse to use a casket or an urn that you bought online or at a local store or somewhere else, and they can't charge you a fee to use it.
Now, I imagine there is some federal laws regarding funerals and burials, but doesn't some of it vary state by state as to what the laws are?
That's right. State and local laws do vary. There are some constants. For example, I'm not aware of any state law that requires a consumer to buy a casket if they're going to be cremated. I'm also not aware of any state that requires embalming in every situation. The FTC's funeral rule is a federal rule that does apply to all providers in every state. So in addition to those state and local laws that may cover things, this funeral rule does apply in every state. And it actually prohibits funeral providers from misleading consumers about the law. That's an important provision. So for instance, a funeral provider cannot state that a casket is required for cremation when in fact it's not, right? So that would be a violation of the rule. And in fact, under the rule, funeral providers are required to tell consumers that alternative containers are available for cremation, and they must make those available. These might be an unfinished wood or a pressed wood or a fiberboard or cardboard container. A funeral provider should know the law in their area, and if a provider is requiring a particular good or service, a consumer can ask whether it's the law and whether they really have to purchase it or whether it's just something they recommend. As I said, the provider must not mislead the consumers, but families should not be afraid or embarrassed to ask questions about the details and the requirements of the services and goods that are being offered.
Well, you talk about that, embarrassment, and I think for some it might seem insensitive to even talk about costs, but really it's a necessary thing to think about how much you'll have available for these different aspects of the funeral and cemetery costs. For instance, you might cut costs related to viewing time for doing it one day or even an hour. Things like that. What would you recommend that people think about as far as cutting down on some of the costs of the funeral arrangements?
That's a terrific question, right? So thinking ahead about, are there ways that we might be able to reduce some of the costs and still be respectful and honor our loved one? So most of these choices about funerals are very personal, and having them be, reflect your traditions, your culture, your religion, or your family and personal preferences can be very helpful. Some suggestions that the FTC lists in its shopping guide to reduce costs are, one of them you've mentioned is choosing a less expensive casket. The rule requires that consumers get a list of the options. The casket expense can be quite large and it can get quite expensive. So that's a way to reduce costs. Choosing direct cremation or an immediate burial can significantly reduce costs by not offering a visitation or a viewing, which may require additional expenses. Even simple things like choosing a special outfit for the deceased rather than purchasing new burial clothes can be meaningful and reduce costs. Another thing that people may not know is that all military veterans are entitled to a free burial in a national cemetery, and the eligibility requirements extend to some civilians. So this is an important place for people to check out if there's been military service in the family. For more information, they can contact the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I understand some state and local laws may also, or policies or programs may also be helpful for consumers in reducing costs. Of course, in the end, talking about funeral plans, asking questions, and comparison shopping is probably the best way to make informed and thoughtful decisions about those funeral arrangements.
I think one of the keys here, Patricia, is that we really don't know what a loved one wants in a lot of cases. It's not just about the costs involved, but maybe that loved one doesn't want anything elaborate, or maybe they do want something more. And just talking about it helps us to know what they would want.
That's right. Very important.
What would you say are some warning signs that people should look for when they're considering different funeral homes or even different cemeteries? What are the things that would be a red flag?
So when choosing a funeral home, there's a lot of things that consumers can do. They can certainly inquire and get information directly from the home and do their research. You also can check businesses out through the Better Business Bureau and other sources. Most consumers do a little bit of research and choose someone in their area, usually based off of a recommendation of a family or friend. Just like all shopping decisions, whenever someone is purchasing an item, we recommend that you get a recommendation, check out a company, and learn a little bit about the company before choosing something.
Well, I've heard about people who buy their cemetery plots ahead of time. Is that a good thing to think about as well, to reserve that space in the cemetery ahead of time?
A lot of people choose to do a pre-need arrangement, and that you can do pre-need arrangements on a variety of issues, whether it's the cemetery plot, the casket, the actual arrangements with a funeral home. Planning your own funeral arrangements, of course, is a way that people see to ease the burden on the family. They can shop and compare goods and services ahead of time. But there's some important considerations, whether it's purchasing the funeral services themselves or the cemetery ahead of time. You want to know what it is you're actually paying for. Are you buying only, the plot? What about the additional services, like the actual burial service? You want to know the full cost and what happens if you're paying ahead of time, what happens to that money. Some states have requirements for handling prepaid funds for advanced funeral arrangements. And what happens is there interest on that money? Are you protected if that firm or that cemetery goes out of business or something changes?
Mm-hmm.
Can you cancel the transaction? Lots of questions. What if you move away or die? Lots of questions that consumers would want to think ahead before planning a funeral prepay arrangement or purchasing a cemetery plot. Good questions to think about.
We're talking with Patricia Poss, an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. She's telling us about the funeral rule. Now, you mentioned, Patricia, earlier that military veterans have the advantage of a free burial in national cemeteries. How many states have an area like that? Does pretty much every state have that available, a national cemetery, or would you possibly have to be buried in a different state?
For details about those programs for the military veterans, the best source to go to is the Department of Veterans Affairs, and to find out what options are available, which ones are closest to you, and who those benefits will extend to. Sometimes they extend even to spouses and dependent children. But the best source for that type of information is the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other mistakes, and maybe something we haven't covered? Typically, what are some of the mistakes that people make in end-of-life decisions that they're coming to?
Knowing what your loved one wants ahead of time, talking as a group to decide with the family what it is you want to do to honor the loved one can really help with planning. As we said, these can be expensive. So taking the time to do that and then being able to do a little bit of research, check things out, get recommendations from others about funeral providers and the options that are available, and of course, understanding what the costs are going to be ahead of time, all can be extremely helpful.
Patricia Poss, an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. How can folks find out more? What is the website and the articles? You mentioned a brochure that's available.
So those who want more information can go to www.ftc.gov and find information. If you put in our search bar there for funeral services or funeral, you'll find two important brochures for consumers. One is called Shopping for Funeral Services, and the other is called Paying Final Respects, Your Rights When Buying Funeral Goods and Services. And I encourage folks to check those out.
All right, ftc.gov. Patricia Poss, thank you very much for helping us today to understand these issues.
Thank you for having me. A really important topic. I'm glad to hear you sharing information about this.
My name is Mike Dyes. Join us again next week for Weekend Connection.
Thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.